The morning count at Elmira Correctional Facility in upstate New York happened at 5:30 a.m. every day without exception. Guards moving through the cell blocks with clipboards and flashlights, accounting for every inmate in the maximum security prison. On the morning of August 14, 2019, cell 247 in D block was empty when Officer Martinez shined his light through the bars. The bed was made to look occupied, pillows and bundled clothing arranged under the blanket to suggest a sleeping body, but the man who was supposed to be there, Marcus Webb, 31 years old, serving 12 years for armed robbery, was gone. The discovery triggered immediate protocols. Sirens blared throughout the facility. All inmates were locked down in their cells for an emergency count. Guards searched every corner of the prison, every closet and utility room and crawl space where a man might hide. The perimeter was examined for signs of breach. Sniffer dogs were deployed. The state police were notified within minutes. By 7 a.m., prison officials confirmed what the evidence suggested. Marcus Webb had escaped sometime during the night, squeezing through a ventilation shaft he'd been slowly widening for weeks, crawling through ductwork to reach the roof, then using a rope made from torn bedsheets to descend the exterior wall in a blind spot between security cameras. He'd timed his escape perfectly, during a shift change when guard attention was divided, and he'd been gone for at least 4 hours before anyone noticed. A manhunt began immediately. State police set up roadblocks on highways leading away from Elmira. Local law enforcement in surrounding counties was alerted. Marcus's photograph was distributed to media outlets, his face appearing on morning news broadcasts across New York State. A black man, 6 feet tall, 190 pounds, last seen wearing prison-issue clothing, considered dangerous, approach with caution. But what authorities didn't initially understand was that Marcus wasn't running randomly. He had a specific destination, a specific target, and a specific purpose that had been consuming him for the past 3 months, ever since he'd received a letter that had destroyed everything he believed about his life. Marcus Webb had been incarcerated at Elmira for 4 years when that letter arrived. He'd been arrested in 2015 for armed robbery, a crime he'd committed out of desperation when he'd been unemployed for 8 months and facing eviction. He'd held up a convenience store in Syracuse with an unloaded gun, had gotten $340 from the register, and had been caught within hours because he'd been high on marijuana and had left his wallet at the scene. The armed robbery charge carried a mandatory minimum sentence, and despite it being his first serious offense, despite the gun being unloaded, despite the small amount of money involved, he'd been sentenced to 12 years. Prison was exactly as terrible as Marcus had feared. The violence, the dehumanization, the constant noise and lack of privacy, the food that barely qualified as edible, the guards who ranged from indifferent to sadistic, the gang politics that determined who was safe and who was prey. Marcus had survived by keeping his head down, staying out of conflicts, doing his time as quietly as possible while counting the days until his release in 2027. What made prison bearable was Diana. His wife Diana, the woman he'd married 5 years before his arrest, the person who'd stood by him through the trial and sentencing, who'd visited him twice a month every month since his incarceration, who'd written him letters every week, who'd promised to be waiting for him when he got out. Diana Reeves had met Marcus in 2008 when they were both working at a Target in Syracuse. She'd been a cashier, he'd been in the stockroom, and they'd started dating after months of flirting during shift overlaps. Diana was beautiful in a striking way, tall, slender, with high cheekbones and full lips and a voice that was slightly husky and incredibly sexy. She was 23 when they met, Marcus was 20, and they'd connected immediately despite their different backgrounds. Diana had been raised by a single mother in Syracuse, had dropped out of high school at 16, had worked various retail and service jobs to support herself. She didn't talk much about her past, about her family or her childhood, but Marcus hadn't pushed because everyone had things they preferred to keep private. What mattered was their present and their future together. They dated for 2 years before Marcus proposed in 2010. The wedding was small at Syracuse City Hall, with just a few friends witnessing their vows. They'd rented a one-bedroom apartment in a rough neighborhood, worked their jobs at Target, talked about saving money for a house eventually, about having kids, about building a normal, stable life together. The marriage had been good, genuinely good. Diana was affectionate, supportive, interested in Marcus's thoughts and feelings. They had an active sex life that Marcus found satisfying, though Diana always preferred the lights off and was shy about her body in ways Marcus attributed to insecurity. She'd never let him see her fully naked in bright light, always dressed and undressed in the bathroom, wore oversized t-shirts to bed. Marcus had assumed this was normal female modesty, had never questioned it or pushed her to be more open. When Marcus was arrested in 2015, Diana had been devastated but loyal. She'd attended every day of his trial, had cried when the guilty verdict was read, had promised him during their last conversation before he was transported to prison that she'd wait for him, that their marriage would survive this, that love meant not abandoning someone during their worst moment. And she'd kept that promise for 4 years. Visiting twice a month like clockwork, writing letters that Marcus read dozens of times, sending him money for commissary, accepting his collect calls from the prison phone system even though they were outrageously expensive. During visits, they'd sit across from each other in the visiting room with its plastic chairs and vending machines, holding hands across the table, talking about their days and their dreams and their plans for when Marcus got out. Diana had gotten a better job during Marcus's incarceration, working as an administrative assistant at a medical practice in Syracuse, making enough money to move to a nicer apartment. She'd sent Marcus photos of the new place, a 2-bedroom in a safer neighborhood that she said she was keeping ready for his return. She talked about how they'd redecorate together, about the life they'd rebuild. Marcus had survived prison by focusing on that future. Every terrible day, every degrading moment, every night lying in his bunk listening to men crying or fighting or doing things he tried not to think about, he'd endure it by imagining the day he'd walk out of Elmira and Diana would be waiting, and they'd go home to their apartment and start over. Then, on May 3, 2019, Marcus received a letter that destroyed that future completely. The letter wasn't from Diana. It was from a woman named Patricia Morris who identified herself as Diana's mother, someone Marcus had never met or even heard Diana mention. The letter was brief and devastating. "Dear Marcus, I'm writing to tell you the truth about the person you married. Diana isn't who you think she is. Her real name is David Reeves. She was born male and transitioned to female when she was 18 years old. She never told you because she was afraid you'd reject her. I know this because I'm her mother and I watched her transition. I'm telling you now because you deserve to know who you're wasting your life waiting for. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Patricia Morris." Marcus read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking, his mind refusing to process the words. Diana was trans? Diana had been born male? The woman he'd been married to for 9 years, the woman he'd had sex with hundreds of times, the woman he'd built his entire future around, had been assigned male at birth? His first reaction was that this was a cruel joke, someone's idea of a twisted prank. But the letter had details that suggested legitimacy. It included Diana's birth name, David Allen Reeves. It included her birth date, which matched what Marcus knew. It included the address of the apartment in Syracuse where Diana had grown up, an address Marcus had never thought to verify but which was consistent with the general area Diana had mentioned coming from. Marcus felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. If this was true, if Diana was transgender, it meant their entire relationship had been built on deception. She'd never told him, never given him the choice of whether to marry someone who was trans, had allowed him to believe she was cisgender for their entire marriage. He felt betrayed in a way that was more devastating than anything he'd experienced in prison. The violence, the degradation, the loss of freedom, all of that had been imposed on him by external forces. But this betrayal, if it was real, had been imposed by the person he trusted most, the person who was supposed to love him honestly. Over the next several days, Marcus became obsessed with verifying the letter's claims. He asked other inmates how to research someone's background from inside prison, learned about public records databases, paid another inmate who had outside contacts to investigate Diana's history. The information that came back confirmed Patricia's letter. Birth records showed a David Allen Reeves born in Syracuse in 1985 to Patricia Morris. School records showed David Reeves attending Syracuse public schools until age 16. There was no record of a Diana Reeves existing before 2003, which was when David would have been 18, the age Patricia claimed Diana had transitioned. Marcus felt his reality fragmenting. Every memory of his marriage now felt contaminated by deception. Their wedding vows, where Diana had promised honesty and transparency. Their intimate moments, when Marcus had believed he was with a cisgender woman. Their plans for children, which Diana had always deflected by saying she wasn't ready yet, a deflection that now made sense if she was physically incapable of pregnancy. He wrote Diana a letter, brief and direct. I received information about your past, about who you were before we met. I need you to tell me the truth. Were you born male? Are you transgender? I need to hear it from you. Diana's response came a week later. The letter was long, emotional, and confirmed everything Patricia had written. Yes, I'm transgender. Yes, I was male at birth. Yes, I made my transition when I was 18. And yes, I've hidden this from you throughout our entire relationship because I was terrified if I told you, you'd reject me because I've fallen in love with you and couldn't bear to lose you, and every day that passed without telling you made it harder to say it to you. And years had gone by and the deception is too massive to confess. I know I should have told you. I know I stole your right to make an informed choice about who you married. But Marcus, I love you. I've always loved you. Everything about our marriage has been real except this one thing I kept hidden. I'm still the same person you fell in love with. I'm still the woman who's been waiting for you. Please don't let this destroy us. Please try to understand why I was too afraid to tell you. Marcus read Diana's letter in his cell, his cellmate watching nervously because Marcus's face had gone completely blank in a way that suggested something inside him had broken. When he finished reading, Marcus carefully folded the letter, placed it in the box where he kept Diana's other letters, and lay down on his bunk staring at the ceiling. His cellmate, a man named Jerome who was serving 20 years for manslaughter, eventually asked if Marcus was okay. Marcus didn't respond for a long time, then finally said in a voice devoid of emotion, "My wife lied to me about who she is for our entire marriage. Everything I thought I knew was a lie." Jerome, who'd been incarcerated long enough to have seen men break in various ways, recognized that Marcus was approaching a psychological cliff edge. "What are you gonna do?" "I don't know yet," Marcus said. But he was lying. He already knew. The knowledge had crystallized in his mind the moment he'd read Diana's confirmation, sharp and clear and terrible. He was going to kill her. Not because she was transgender. Marcus didn't have particularly strong feelings about trans people one way or another, but because she deceived him, had stolen his autonomy, had made him complicit in a relationship he would never have consented to if he'd known the truth. She treated him like he didn't deserve honesty, like his informed consent didn't matter, like she had the right to decide for him who he'd marry. That level of deception, sustained over years, felt unforgivable to Marcus. Felt like a violation so profound that it erased every good memory they'd built together. And the only way to reclaim his sense of control, his sense of agency over his own life, was to end hers. He began planning his escape that same week. He had 8 years left on his sentence, but 8 years felt impossible to endure with the knowledge of Diana's deception consuming him. He needed to act while the rage was fresh, while it could fuel him through the risks and difficulty of escaping a maximum security prison. Marcus was assigned to a maintenance crew that cleaned the prison's ventilation system, a job he'd gotten months earlier because of good behavior. The work gave him access to areas most inmates never saw, including the ductwork that ran through the facility's ceilings. He'd noticed during his cleaning duties that one particular vent in a storage room near his cell block was loose, the screws rusted and easy to remove. Over 3 months, Marcus carefully widened the vent opening during his maintenance shifts, working slowly enough that the damage wouldn't be noticed during inspections. He collected materials for his escape: bedsheets torn and braided into rope, a metal file stolen from the workshop, a screwdriver he'd fashioned from a piece of rebar. He studied the guard rotation patterns, identified the window during shift change when supervision was weakest. He told no one about his plans, not even Jerome. The first rule of prison was that you couldn't trust anyone with information that could be traded for favors or reduced sentences. Marcus smiled during Diana's visits while planning her murder, accepted her letters while imagining confronting her, nodded when she talked about their future while knowing she had no future. Diana seemed to sense something had changed between them but misunderstood the nature of the change. She thought Marcus was processing the revelation about her transgender identity, thought he needed time to adjust but would eventually forgive her. She wrote him longer letters trying to explain her perspective, trying to make him understand why she'd been too afraid to tell him the truth. "I watched so many trans women get rejected by men they loved," Diana wrote in one letter. "I watched friends lose everything when they were honest about their past. I was so afraid of losing you that I convinced myself it was better to never tell you. I know that was wrong. I know I hurt you. But please believe that everything else about our relationship was real. My love for you was real. Our marriage was real. I'm still the person you fell in love with." Marcus read these letters with ice in his veins, his anger hardening into something cold and focused. Diana was still trying to manipulate him, still trying to center her fear and her needs rather than acknowledging that she'd stolen years of his life based on deception. She was sorry she'd been caught, not sorry for the deception itself. He stopped writing back, stopped accepting her calls. When Diana showed up for their scheduled visit in July, Marcus refused to see her. She wrote frantic letters asking what was wrong, begging him to communicate, promising she'd do anything to fix their marriage. Marcus didn't respond to any of them. The night of August 13, 2019, Marcus executed his escape plan. During the evening count at 9 p.m., he was present and accounted for in his cell. After lights out at 10 p.m., he arranged the pillows and clothes in his bunk to suggest a sleeping body, then used his makeshift screwdriver to remove the ventilation grate in the hallway ceiling during a moment when the guard had stepped away. He pulled himself into the ductwork, replaced the grate behind him, and crawled through the ventilation system toward the roof access point he'd identified. The ducts were cramped and stifling, the metal hot from the summer day's accumulated heat, but Marcus forced himself forward with single-minded determination. He reached the roof access after 40 minutes of crawling, used his metal file to force open the locked panel, and emerged onto the prison roof under a moonless sky. He tied one end of his rope to a roof vent, tested its strength, then lowered himself down the exterior wall on the north side of the facility where he'd memorized a camera blind spot. The descent was terrifying, the braided bedsheets stretching under his weight, his hands burning from gripping the rough fabric. But the rope held, and Marcus reached the ground without triggering any alarms. He was outside the prison walls, technically free for the first time in 4 years. He ran into the woods that bordered the facility's north side, ran for 30 minutes until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out, putting as much distance as possible between himself and Elmira before the morning count would reveal his absence. He knew he had limited time before every law enforcement agency in New York was looking for him, before his face was on every news broadcast, before roadblocks made travel nearly impossible. He had maybe 12 hours before the manhunt made it too dangerous to move freely. He headed south toward Syracuse, sticking to wooded areas and back roads, avoiding highways and populated areas where someone might recognize him. He'd memorized Diana's address from her letters, knew exactly where she lived, knew she'd be home because she worked Monday through Friday and this was a Wednesday night. Marcus had no weapon except the metal file he'd used to escape, but he didn't need anything more sophisticated than a knife for what he planned. He broke into a hunting cabin around 3 a.m., found a hunting knife in a drawer, and took it along with some clothes that were close enough to his size to pass at a distance. He reached the outskirts of Syracuse by dawn on August 14th, just as news of his escape was breaking on morning radio. He heard his own name on a car radio as he walked past a house, heard himself described as dangerous and potentially violent, heard the reporter mention that authorities were concerned he might target his wife given recent issues in their relationship. They were right to be concerned. Marcus reached Diana's apartment building in Syracuse around 10 a.m. It was a 3-story complex in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where people mostly kept to themselves and didn't pay attention to who was coming and going. Marcus waited in a small park across the street, watching Diana's second-floor apartment, waiting for confirmation she was home. At 11:30 a.m. he saw her through the window. Diana was moving around her apartment, visible in brief glimpses through the curtains, going about her day completely unaware that her husband had escaped from prison and was watching her from across the street. Marcus felt no hesitation, no last-minute doubt about what he was about to do. Diana had stolen 4 years of his marriage through deception, had made him complicit in a relationship he would never have chosen with full information, had treated his autonomy and consent as less important than her fear of rejection. She deserved what was coming. He entered the building through a side door that was propped open for a resident who was moving boxes, climbed the stairs to the second floor, and approached Diana's apartment. He knocked on the door, then stood to the side so he wouldn't be visible through the peephole. Diana opened the door without checking who was there, probably expecting a neighbor or a delivery. Her face went from neutral to shocked to terrified in the space of a second when she saw Marcus standing there with the hunting knife visible in his hand. "Marcus, oh my God, what are you doing here? Did you escape? You need to turn yourself in." Marcus pushed past her into the apartment, closed and locked the door behind him. Diana backed away, her hands up in a placating gesture, her voice shaking as she tried to reason with him. "Marcus, please, let's talk about this. I know you're angry about what I didn't tell you, but this isn't the way to handle it. You're going to get yourself killed or locked up for the rest of your life." "You lied to me," Marcus said, his voice eerily calm. "For our entire marriage, you lied to me about who you are. You took away my choice. You made me live a life I never would have chosen if I'd known the truth." "I know," Diana said, tears streaming down her face. "I know I was wrong. I was afraid and selfish and I should have trusted you with the truth. But Marcus, I love you. Everything else about us was real. Our connection, our relationship, our love. That was all real even if I hid this one thing." "This one thing was everything," Marcus said. "Your biological sex, your transition, your past, that's not a small detail. That's fundamental information I had the right to know before I married you." "You're right," Diana agreed desperately. "You're absolutely right. I stole your informed consent and that was wrong and unforgivable. But killing me won't fix that. It'll just destroy what's left of your life. Please, Marcus, please put down the knife." They stood facing each other in Diana's living room, the apartment decorated with photos of their wedding and their life together, evidence of the relationship Marcus now saw as built entirely on deception. He looked at those photos and felt nothing but rage. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" Marcus asked. "Or were you just going to keep lying forever?" "I don't know," Diana admitted. "I kept waiting for the right moment, but there was never a right moment. And the longer I waited, the harder it became. By the time I realized I should have told you at the beginning, we were already married and I couldn't figure out how to tell you without losing you." "You're losing me now," Marcus said. "Permanently." He moved toward her with the knife. Diana tried to run, tried to reach the bedroom where she could lock herself in and call 911, but Marcus was faster and stronger. He grabbed her from behind, pulled her down to the floor, and stabbed her repeatedly while she screamed and tried to fight him off. The attack was brutal and sustained, Marcus's rage driving the knife into Diana's back, her sides, her chest. She begged him to stop, cried out that she was sorry, that she loved him, that she didn't want to die. But Marcus kept stabbing until she stopped moving, until the screaming stopped, until Diana lay dead on the living room floor in a spreading pool of blood. Marcus stood over her body, breathing hard, covered in blood, the knife still in his hand. He felt no satisfaction, no relief, no sense that justice had been served. He just felt empty, the rage that had sustained him through planning and executing his escape now drained away, leaving nothing behind. He heard sirens in the distance. Neighbors had called 911, reporting screams and violence coming from Diana's apartment. Police were responding, were probably already surrounding the building. Marcus had nowhere to go, no escape plan beyond this moment of violence. He sat down on Diana's couch, the same couch visible in photos where they'd posed together during happier times, and waited for the police to break down the door. The arrest happened without incident. Syracuse police breached the apartment door around noon, found Marcus sitting calmly on the couch with the murder weapon beside him and Diana's body on the floor. He didn't resist, didn't try to fight or flee, just allowed himself to be handcuffed and led out of the building past neighbors who'd gathered to watch, past news cameras that had arrived to cover the escaped prisoner who'd murdered his wife. The trial happened quickly. Marcus's attorney tried to argue temporary insanity, claimed that discovering his wife was transgender had caused a psychological break that impaired Marcus's judgment. But the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The planned escape, the stolen knife, the journey to Syracuse specifically to find Diana. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding Marcus guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Marcus showed no emotion during sentencing, didn't speak when given the opportunity to address the court, just accepted that the rest of his life would be spent incarcerated for the murder of his wife. He was transferred to Attica Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison even more brutal than Elmira, where he'd spend the remainder of his life among violent offenders serving similar sentences. His cellmate at Attica was serving life for killing his girlfriend during a domestic dispute, and they'd talk sometimes about the relationships that had led them to murder, the ways that love could transform into violence when betrayal entered the equation. Marcus never expressed remorse for killing Diana. In interviews with prison psychologists, when asked if he regretted his actions, he'd say that Diana had destroyed their marriage through deception and he'd simply ended what was already dead. He maintained that if Diana had been honest from the beginning, none of this would have happened, that her murder was a direct consequence of her choice to lie. The trans community responded to Diana's murder with grief and anger. Advocacy organizations pointed to her death as an example of the violence trans people face when their identity is revealed, the way that disclosure can be literally lethal even within supposedly loving relationships. They argued that Diana had hidden her trans status out of legitimate fear, that the violence she'd experienced was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid by not telling Marcus the truth. But others in the trans community criticized Diana's choice to deceive Marcus, arguing that informed consent in relationships is essential and that hiding such fundamental information from a partner is unethical regardless of the fear motivating that choice. They said Diana's death was tragic but that her deception had created the conditions that led to it. The debate raged in trans forums and advocacy circles. Did Diana deserve to die for lying? No, absolutely not. But did Marcus deserve to know who he was marrying? Yes, absolutely. How do you reconcile those two truths? How do you balance trans people's right to privacy and safety with partners' right to informed consent? There were no easy answers. Diana was dead, murdered by a man who felt betrayed beyond forgiveness. Marcus was imprisoned for life, having destroyed his own future in the process of ending Diana's. And the larger questions about disclosure, consent, and violence remained unresolved. There was no justice in the outcome, no redemption, no lesson that made the tragedy worthwhile. Just two destroyed lives, a family's permanent grief, and a community's ongoing struggle with impossible questions about honesty and safety and consent. And somewhere in between the two extremes of their stories, Marcus's rage and Diana's fear, was a truth neither of them had been able to navigate. that relationships require honesty even when honesty is terrifying, and that betrayal can destroy even the strongest love when trust is broken too completely to repair. Marcus and Diana had both made choices that led to this ending. She'd chosen deception over risk. He'd chosen violence over forgiveness. Neither choice was defensible. Both choices were understandable given their perspectives and circumstances. And that was perhaps the most disturbing truth, that this murder made a terrible kind of sense, that both people had acted according to their own logic and values, and that their individual reasonable responses had combined to create something completely unreasonable. 2 lives destroyed. One by murder. One by a life sentence. And no answer to the question of whether any of it could have been avoided if different choices had been made at any point along the way. Just 2 people who'd loved each other, then destroyed each other, leaving nothing behind but grief and questions that had no satisfactory answers.